Okay, so when you get to your Year 10 pastoral care page, you just need to go down to the section where the assessment tasks are. You'll see down in this section right here we've got the Year 10 SRP.doc. So I'll open it up now. Okay, and this is the task that you were given the other day. You can see there just standard information about the assessment policy and the declaration of originality. And then we move on down to the submission instructions. I guess the major part for these submission instructions is to remember this part here, where it asks you to present 2 copies to your teacher on the due date there for part 1. Second part being to write up the experiment, to actually do the experiment and then to write up the experiment report. You'll notice here it says that in this section your scaffold is provided on that My Classes page, and I'll be going through that shortly. So when you hand in part 1, we will ask you to describe your experiment and we will offer you some recommendations on how you might improve your design. Again, that's why you need to bring 2 copies so you can write down the suggestions from your teacher. When it comes to handing in part 2, you take the suggestions from your teacher and use that to complete your experiment and then write up the experiment in the correct Clancy Catholic College format. Moving on down to our questions that you can possibly investigate. So we've got investigate the strengths of building materials, which part of the refrigerator is best for storing fruit, what is the water holding capacity of different soils, investigate the effects of salinity on plants, investigate the effectiveness of various commercial soaps or detergents in removing stains, and remember, of course, you can do your own problem also, but you must discuss this with your teacher first. Declaration here about not doing anything that's going to be dangerous to yourself or to any other animals or being cruel or anything like that. And now we get down into the nuts and bolts of the assessment task. Okay, going on to part 1. So after you have selected which investigation you are going to do, in part 1 you need to submit answers to the following questions. First one there, clearly state the problem for your experiment and suggest a use for your results. So basically what you're doing here is you're writing an aim for the experiment. However, you'll notice there at the end we've also asked you to suggest a use for your results. Now you remember the question that I had from Andrew the other day where he asked me what does that mean? Well, basically we want you to say there, where could people, after you have finished doing this experiment, who could use your results and get something out of them. So you remember I said about my example about the tennis ball. Well, people who play tennis could get something out of your results. So that's what we want you to do there. Moving on to number 2, you're asked to conduct and summarise research you have collected in order to effectively plan for your investigation. There's 2 sources and a minimum of 2 paragraphs each on those sources. Okay, so it's very important that you write down the word each there as well. Basically the reason for that is, as I explained the other day, there's no way that you can conduct an investigation without knowing something about the thing that you are investigating. That's the reason why we have that section there. It's only 2 sources, so some suggestions are in the scaffold that's provided later, so we will go through that. It's just about doing some basic research so that you know what you're talking about when you start your investigation. Number 3, make a list of the apparatus that will be used. Pretty straightforward, pretty similar to what we do in class all the time. However, this bit here is probably a little bit different. Justify why you use each item. So you need to say exactly why you need to use each item. I know that might sound a little bit tedious, but that's what you need to do in this type of experiment. Moving on to number 4, it's all about variables. We want you to identify the independent variable. There should only be one, Okay, and that is basically the thing that you are testing. So if we go back to my tennis ball example that I spoke about, our independent variable there would be the different types of tennis ball that you used. Okay, so that's the thing that we are testing. Moving on to the dependent variable, well, I guess that's the thing that we measure in our experiment. So if I were to be talking about the tennis balls and how high different tennis balls bounce, the thing that I would measure in that experiment is the height that the tennis balls would bounce. Okay, so basically when you change your independent variable, it should affect the dependent variable, and that's why that one's called independent and one's called dependent. Moving on to C, make a list of all the other variables you need to control when completing the experiment. Now, these are the controlled variables. Okay, so we need to make sure that when we're doing this that we keep the test fair, and the way that we keep the test fair is by keeping every other factor exactly the same. So for example, if we go back to my tennis ball example, if we were dropping different tennis balls, just a different brand of tennis balls on the same surface, we would want to make sure that we were dropping them from the same height. We would want to make sure that we weren't throwing them down. We would want to make sure that we were dropping them on the same surface each time. If we are not keeping those things the same, then our experiment is not a fair test and our results are not. Now, it's very important that you include a control in your experiment. I guess the reason for including a control is so that you have a baseline to compare against. So what I might do if I was comparing some different brands of tennis ball, what I might do is choose probably the least expensive tennis ball and then allow that to bounce, and that would be my control, and I would compare my results against that baseline or that control. Okay, now there's all of these experiments that we've got here need to include a control. Okay, so it's really, really important that you include that there. Moving on after that, you've got the method, very similar to what we do in class regularly, so just go about writing a method as you would. My only advice there would be is that someone needs to be able to copy your experiment exactly. So writing 3 or 4 lines is not going to cut it here. You need to put a lot more detail into it. And just imagine, after you've finished, if you read it and you don't feel that someone could copy it exactly, then you need to add more information. In fact, a tip here might be to read one of your classmates' method. And if you don't understand what they're saying, then you might give them some advice on how or ask them some questions, and then they might be able to improve it, and then they might read yours also. Hypothesis, just you're guessing educated guess about what's going to happen in the experiment, and you might refer back here to your research that you've done in section 2. If you found some information about whatever you're researching, then you can use that information to help you with your hypothesis. And remember here, what do you predict your results will be and why? That's probably the most important part. Why do you believe that will be the answer? And finally, in part 1, a timeline. So you basically want to get the timeline that is attached to the scaffold, and you can fill in there, just say when you're going to do things, and be sensible. You've got plenty of time there over the holidays and in those first 3 weeks to conduct your experiment, so just be sensible there. You don't have to rush it, just complete it correctly, and remember week 3 of next term is when we want to have that due.